Welcome back to 5 Minute Bible Study. This is Mystery Guest Tuesday, which I haven't done in quite a while, so welcome back. I have a special mystery guest, and we're going to be talking about the subject of the Christian and social justice, or the Christian and critical race theory, a very complicated theory that you might have heard of in the news recently, and it's just all the rage. We want to talk about this from, as is insinuated, a Christian perspective. And I have a very special guest who has done a lot of research in this area, not a what you would call a quote-unquote professional, but who has a lot to offer to the subject, especially from a Bible-based perspective, which is something you're not going to get from CNN and Fox News and all these other media networks, which I don't watch anyway. I want to welcome to the show, as it were, Michael Hernandez. I call him Mike. He's my brother-in-law, and hey, Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Aaron. Thanks for having me on 5 Minute Bible Study, and look forward to talking about this important topic that has spiritual implications. So I'm glad that you're conducting this.
Yeah, and thanks for coming on. Mike has, like I said, put a lot of time into this over the last several months, last year really, and we were talking, I think it was at November, Thanksgiving last year, and really, is that about right?
I think that's right.
And we were in your living room in Texas, and at that point, I had really kind of been shunning all news, media, and all of that, so I really wasn't up to par with what was critical race theory. I didn't even know it was such a big rage, and as you were telling me more and more about it, the more I realized, wow, this has a lot of implications for the church, and so maybe I need to be a little more aware of it. How did you kind of become more aware of what is the social justice movement?
Well, I think like you, it touches everything. It seems like in society you can't get a cup of coffee without social justice being, waved around, and so it's literally it's a coined term in America, and it's everywhere. It's at work, the workplace. It's in school. I have 2 school-age kids, and we've had some experience with it there, and so you really can't get away with it, around it and away from it. So I started doing some research, studying on it, and seeing the biblical implications of it. And what really got me motivated to look into this was when I started hearing some Christians who were saying this was something that Christians should be involved in, these political movements, especially on the heels of Black Lives Matter and the riots and all of those things. So it was a very tumultuous time during that summer a couple years ago, year and a half ago. And so, that's how I got into it. Comes at you from everywhere. I think everybody experiences that.
I just want to set forth a few goals before, obviously, like all these Mystery Guest Tuesdays, I have several questions lined up that we're going to go through. I really honestly have not heard the answers to what Mike has to offer to some of these questions. We know what we wanted to talk about generally, but I haven't heard what he has to say yet, so I'm going to learn just as fresh as y'all will. But we want to keep this to 4 main goals, and before we get started, I'll state those. We want it to be Bible-based, because like I said, you're not going to get a Bible perspective from media networks that I know of. So we're going to make sure that everything here is Bible-based. We want to keep it simple, and that's the biggest thing. Even the name critical race theory is complicated to hear, and it scares people because it's such a big phrase, and nobody really knows what it is unless you've been in most academia environments. And so we want to keep it simple. We want to keep it concise. We want to keep it applicable, where we can leave here and actually, use this information from day to day when we encounter other Christians and people in the world. And I guess I lied. It was five things. The last one being we want to warn you watchers here about what is, I believe, a false doctrine. And Mike will be able to speak more to that has actual implications when it comes into the church. So let's keep those at the forefront of our mind as we go through this study. So let's just get right into it. And just starting off, it's always good to get your terms straight and all that. And that's one of the biggest, to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, one of the biggest issues in this whole social justice debate is establishing the right terminology, defining your terms, and so forth. So from the get-go, I would like to ask you, Mike, what would you say, how would you define what is social justice from the very get-go?
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head when you say that defining terms, it's difficult to understand what people mean by social justice. And of course, whenever you take an emotionally laden term like justice, who doesn't want justice in everything, in every aspect of life? So it's an emotionally laden term, and then you attach adjectives to it, and it's rarely defined. And so, but there's a lot of information out there, and you can read the primary sources, and they define it themselves. And so this definition for social justice comes from the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. It's an international group. America is involved in that. But basically, and also I've just looked up Merriam-Webster's dictionary. So basically, social justice in America is defined as egalitarianism. And maybe you don't know what that is. That needs to be defined. But it's the belief for the removal of human inequality, especially with respect to social, political, and economic affairs. And so it has to do with social, political, economic equity. So social justice is involved in looking at traditional structures in a society, and it looks at the oppressive structures in society, and they seek to redistribute the power and the resources from oppressors to victims for the pursuit of equality of outcome. And so that's the basic definition of it. Now, I wanted to add to that the Department of Economic and Social Affairs does also state that throughout generations, men have collaborated together in order to define what is right, what is moral, what is just, what is unjust. And so based on these accepted standards for what they claim is moral and just for society, then they create their interventions, their social justice movements, if you will. And so another thing to add to this is that impartiality and a conformity to an absolute truth is not a concern of social justice. As a matter of fact, they put in their document that present day believers in an absolute truth identified with virtue and justice are neither willing nor desirable companions for the movements of social justice. And so people who have a religious faith that they claim is an absolute truth are not desirable partners to collaborate with. And so you can see right there that it's a worldly affair, and for the Christian, we can see that if you don't believe in an objective truth, there's going to be an issue. There's going to be issues that arise. There's going to be some tension in there. So that's the definition.
So if I'm the listener, I'll just restate this to you and you tell me if I got this right for understanding's sake. It's basically trying to establish equity within our society based off of standards that are set by the people writing this theory, or I guess in the social structure leadership positions.
Yeah, and there's different arms of social justice, and critical race theory, or racial justice, if you will, just is one of the arms. Climate justice is another. Reproductive justice is something that's thrown out there. And so, yeah, this is the basic foundation, and out of that spring forth the different movements for equity based on race, climate, women's rights, all of those types of things.
Yeah, it really is a box of worms when you open it up, and I just became more aware of that semi-recently. But you talked about oppressors and the oppressed in this definition. So when we're talking about if you turn on the news, and even, if this comes into a local church, who in America, at least right now, when we put this to application, are going to be the oppressed group, and who's going to be the oppressor group? What's that look like?
Yeah, so that comes from, critical race theory, critical gender studies, critical queer studies, critical fat studies. The word critical that's where you get that oppressor versus oppressed dynamic. From what I understand in their literature, that comes from critical theory, and it's basically a comes from a Marxist movement from back in the early 1900s. Karl Marx said that he looked at society as oppressors versus oppressed, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, and that there needed to be revolution in order to overcome the opposing forces. And so these critical theorists took that Marxist idea and applied it to cultural things like race, like climate, like gender, and started pitting together this oppressor-oppressed dynamic. And so in some of the literature you can see, the oppressors in society for critical race theory are the white hegemonic patriarchal power. So white men, Christian, these are all in the hierarchy of oppressors, and those that are non-white, people of color, they call Buddhists, other types of religions, are on the oppressed category. So that would be the critical aspect of critical race theory. Critical gender studies, it's male and female. So the patriarchy is the one that's the oppressor, while women are the oppressed. LGBTQ justice, heterosexuality. So you can see that's the dynamic with critical theory, and the critical word in those studies, that's what that means.
So I guess I kind of got ahead of myself there, actually, which I was going to ask you, what is critical race theory? And I guess with that being said, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so critical race theory, I'm just going to quote it from one of their founders, Delgado and Stefanchik, in their book, Introduction to Critical Race Theory. Here's just what they say. The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. So right there, you can kind of see that critical piece of it. It's concerned about power, the relationship of power, oppressor versus oppressed, with the aspect of race involved in that. And so that's their basic definition. And he goes on to say that although CRT began as a movement in law, which a lot of people understand that, and they'll throw that out there, that it's just something that was used in the study of law, it's a theory of law, but this says that it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many scholars in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists who use these ideas to understand issues of school discipline, hierarchy, affirmative action, curriculum, all of these things. And so you can see that it's not just isolated to, that's something that's thrown out there, that, oh, this is just a tool that's used as a theory of law. Well, it's not. It's spread beyond that. And if you have kids in school, we faced that with our kids already. It's in education. It's crossed over into other disciplines. And so just wanted to mention that as a part of it as well. But basically, critical race theory is looking at the relationship of power structures in society in relation to power, into relation to race. And it has 3 or 4 basic tenets. And first is that racism is ordinary. It's the normal science, the usual way society does business. And it's the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. So that's the first tenet, that it's everywhere. You can't get away from it. It's in your relationships. If you have a relationship with somebody who's black and you're white, racism is always present. It's in every relationship, in every institution. It's not, as one person says, one activist says, it's not if racism has happened, it's where it has happened. It's not if, but where is the racism in the situation. And so that's the first, that it's everywhere. Secondly, there's this idea of white over color ascendancy, and it serves important purposes, both psychic and material, for the dominant group. What that means is that basically it's sometimes called interest convergence, and in this book they use the example of Brown versus the Board of Education in the 1960s, where desegregation happened. Well, they believe that that really didn't happen for the benefit necessarily of the blacks, but more the white elites benefited from that. And so there's this interest convergence, that white over color ascendancy. There's this hierarchy there that, it serves white people psychically. And so the reason why they desegregated and made that law is not because they wanted to really benefit blacks, but because it served white people psychically. And then it served other white people materially for the dominant group. And I hope that kind of makes sense. Those are the first two major things out there. And so it's kind of this pessimistic idea that there has been no advancement in race relations in society in America. And it's just kind of, it appears to be that way, but it's really hidden. It's really hidden. You've got to dig deep. You got to go kind of like ghost hunting for it. It gives you a rationale to go ghost hunting for it. Really a pessimistic way of looking at things, and really a pessimistic way of looking at relationships. If you're a friend with somebody of a different ethnicity, you're always looking for the racism and the guilt and the victimhood and the oppressor and the oppressed, all of these different things. And so those are the two basic things that I'll say about critical race theory.
So to make that practical for our audience, and just practical. If I have basically a black brother, since I'm white, and I have a black brother, say, that goes to church with me, and I try to do something nice for him, like, I want to get him dinner, then this theory is saying, well, number one, racism is normal. It's just the way things are. And because it's normal and I can't escape it, that I'm actually doing this for my own interest. And one of the options could be that I just want to convince people around me that I'm actually not racist by doing something kind to this black brother. That would be one interpretation using this critical race theory worldview. Would that be an accurate example?
Yeah, I think that's accurate, and I think it really fits in with the idea of microaggressions. It's just whatever somebody decides is a racist action on somebody's behalf or racist thought, then that thing is labeled as a microaggression, something to be repented of, if you will. Really pessimistic way of looking at people.
That actually is a good place, I think, to introduce, what is racism? We've talked about social justice, critical race theory. Those are the bigger, more general categories. But what's just a basic definition of racism based off of everything that we just said?
I think first we need to understand racism is it's a sin of partiality. We read about Peter being withstood to the face by Paul for playing the hypocrite. For when the Jews were around, he wouldn't eat with the Gentiles. And so the sin of partiality is real, and so racism is a sin. And when I think of racism, I think of, you're treating others differently based on that ethnicity, that race, that there's a superiority involved there on the behalf of the person that's being racist. CRT, they're looking at it at a more macro level, at the systemic level, and they're saying racism is everywhere. Now the activists will say that it's in every relationship as well. Some go so far as to say that all white people are racist in society, and I've heard Christians say that too. All white people are systemically racist because they're socialized into it. There's this social engineering over the generations that you just can't escape it. And so either way you slice it, whether you're looking at it at a systemic level or at the individual level, it still means that an individual at the end of the day is partial, if that makes sense.
That's the biblical definition.
Right.
And to this point, we've talked about some technicalities, and if you're the watcher and you're the listener and you're thinking all this is just too complicated and there's really no relativeness to me, I just want to let you know, just very, very recently, a brother in Christ told me that he was racist based off of this critical race theory definition, and that I'm probably racist too and don't even realize it. So that's a very practical way of how this floats into the church and why this is a dangerous doctrine, by redefining what racism is based off of this relatively new worldview, which did not come from the Bible. So I just thought I would interject that just to keep people on board here.
Yeah, it is, and that's good, Aaron. It is relevant. As I mentioned, I've heard Christians saying that all white people are racist. And then when I press about whether the church is systemically racist, I get no answers to that. So this is definitely a relevant thing, and the only reason I even started looking into this at all. And so we need to be mindful of it. It's something that's taught in school to kids as well, in many places. And so it's good to have an awareness. You know, Paul, over there in the book of Acts, he went into Athens, and he was in Ephesus, and they were, he was trying to preach the gospel to the people, and he saw that they had many idols, and he had an awareness of the culture and what was going on. And so this is some social engineering that these theorists in society, these sociologists, are playing with, and we need to be mindful of it and have a little bit of a pulse on it, so that we can defend the truth and also help other Christians to be wary of it and to be edified through the true teaching on what is partiality and how we're supposed to address it. And I'll say one more thing, that it's interesting to see how this social engineering experiment over race, gender, sexuality is happening in society. It's everywhere, and it's creating division and a lot of animosity between people. And the more that this continues, the more and more angry people are getting. And we need to just be mindful to let the world do the world things, and let the church do godly things.